said hello to Ejim already. So.
Thank you all for being here. As we introduce this morning, this second and last day of our summit is going to focus on challenges and hope for U.S. democracy. If you were here with us earlier this morning, we had an incredible panel raising some of the challenges and threats we're facing to our democracy, but also focusing on some of the hope that we have as well. One of the themes you heard from that panel is that from the beginning, U.S. democracy was never structured to be inclusive. It was never meant to be inclusive. It was from the beginning meant to be exclusive. So much of our growth as a democracy over the past couple of centuries has been hopefully a growth toward becoming more inclusive. Today's panel, our closing chat, is entitled this very intentionally, Toward a More Inclusive Democracy. What are the ways we can, what are the things we can do? What are the steps we can take to move forward away from exclusion toward more inclusion? When you plan a summit program like this, and after this panel, you'll be meeting many of the people who helped plan this program with me. When you come to this final closing chat, you have a dream list of who are the people we would most want to be here. And you put that list on the board, and then you hope, if we could just get one of those three, we'll be happy. If we get two of those three, it'd be remarkable. If we get 3 for 3, we should play the lottery.
Yes.
Really lucky. And we got 3 for 3 on this one. We said it'd be great if Senator Dodd had the time and the willingness to moderate this chat. And who are two voices, who are two leading experts on racial and social justice that we would just love to see him chatting with? And we thought about it in the sense of, if there were just 4 of us around a dinner table, who would we want to hear from as we think about steps toward a more inclusive democracy? So I will allow Senator Dodd to introduce the 2 leading experts we have, but first I want to introduce him. Senator Dodd has represented Connecticut in the United States Congress for 36 years, one of our longest serving representatives in the state. And when we talked in the previous panel about the need for better legislation, the need for more inclusive legislation, he has authored and co-authored exactly some of that type of legislation that has helped us become a better place. Most notably, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which he authored, which to date, over 200 million Americans have benefited from. He is currently the Special Advisor to the Americas. That's a small project. He just has the whole Americas, so he's President Biden's Special Advisor to the Americas. But for us, most importantly, he is the patron, the friend, and the vision of the work we do here at the Dodd Center for Human Rights and the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute and the Dodd Human Rights Impact Programs, which I direct. So we're thrilled to have Senator Dodd able to moderate this fireside chat for us, and I will now turn it to him for a further introduction.
Well, thank you, Jim, very much. And let me just begin. I know that I hope many of you have actually been able to participate over the last couple of days, but for those of you who haven't, let me just say again what I've said from the beginning. This has been a fabulous 2 days. Some 30 years ago, when the original meeting occurred, just think about, I mentioned John Castine, the former president of this university, called me and asked whether or not my father's papers from the Nuremberg trials would be available. And it started there. And it is sort of grown, if you will, into what it's become. And I can't think of a better example of what we need to do more of in the country than what we've been doing here for the last 2 days. And my prayer would be, as I get older, that long after we've moved on, that there'll be a center here that will welcome people to come together to exactly what we just heard on the last panel. It's not that you want to agree necessarily with everything that gets said on this stage, but we need to have places where people can be heard and debate can happen and dialogue can happen. If we don't allow that and create the spaces, then we can't expect people to necessarily come. And so we've built a place to use, as I said last night, the old movie line, and a field of dreams. If we build it, they will come. In a sense, you've proven that over the last 2 days. We've built something here and you've come. And we've had wonderful people, such as the ones we're going to hear from this morning, who contribute to that. They have come as well, and the people who've participated over the last 2 days. So thank you, Jim, again. Thanks for the staff here, all the people. I won't go through what I did the other night and recite the names of everyone who's made a difference here, but believe me, they've made a remarkable contribution in building what we have here today at the University of Connecticut. So thank everyone who's been a part of that as well. Let me just briefly introduce our guests here. Jim has already sort of done that in a generic way. But let me start with Ejim Dike. We've met and chatted already a little bit over the last couple of days. She is a senior fellow at Western States Center, a human rights advocate and strategist for over 20 years of experience building inclusive political processes. She served as the executive director of the Human Rights Network, has extensive experience using human rights mechanisms to advance justice and accountability, particularly in the UN, for grassroots activists. Her substantive expertise includes international human rights law, racial justice, gender equality, government accountability, and economic, social, and cultural rights. That's a mouthful. That's a lot. I'll tell you. Well, congratulations for all that work. Carol Anderson, delighted you're here as well, Carol, and thank you for being a part of it.
Thank you so much.
Is the Charles Howard Candler, is that, am I correct in pronunciation? Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, the author of some 5 books, several of which have won numerous awards. And I don't recite them in the introduction, but they're incredible books that have been so incredibly recognized.
Absolutely.
New York Times bestsellers, awards have been given, so plentiful. Some of the things you've written, just the titles of the books say what you're about to read, so fantastic, and thank you for doing it. Carol was the recipient of many awards I've mentioned, received the Ella Baker Lifetime Achievement Award as well as several other honors and achievements. She has testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. I didn't serve on that committee. I wanted to go back and necessarily wonder if I said anything in the committee. I served on the House Judiciary Committee years ago. She served on working groups in regard to race, minority rights, criminal justice at multiple academic institutes and the United Nations. It's a pleasure again, Carol, to welcome you, and thank you immensely, both of you, but thank you for your works, your writing, all the things that you've done. Jim has introduced the title of this, and towards an inclusive democracy. I want to just, before asking some prompt questions here and having a good discussion, you ought to be thinking as well as an audience about questions you'd like to raise as well, because I think everybody's ideas and thoughts on how we do this are critical. But you may have heard over the last 2 days, those of you who've been here, we have a program which has been supported. It's in its infancy, but we're trying to move it forward. And it's called Human Rights Close to Home. And the idea to that, for that came when we started some years ago talking about how to work with local schools in terms of some basic civics and human rights lessons along the way. And then I read the speech that Eleanor Roosevelt gave in 1958 at the United Nations. And I just want to quote to you the opening paragraph, because it says it all, because if we don't begin here, and the subject we have today goes to the heart of what she said that many years ago. She said, "Where, after all, do universal rights begin? In small places, close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he or she lives in, the school or college he or she attends, the factory, farm, or office where he or she works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination." That sort of captures what the title is of our discussion this morning, in a sense. And you've got to begin there. I know we talk a lot about what major institutions can do. Obviously, the United Nations, the United States Congress, world organizations, critically important. But if we want to succeed at this, we also need to make sure that the average person who doesn't get up every day thinking about these subject matters, but can embrace these ideas, particularly in a democracy. Lastly, I'll just share one thought with you. When they wrote the founding documents of our country, I've been intrigued by this. There are 2 words that never appear, not in the Declaration of Independence, not in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And the 2 words are democracy and compromise. And yet the very essence of democracy depends upon compromise. I can't remember anyone who ever ran for public office saying, "Elect me, I'm a hell of a compromiser." That's not exactly what we're attracted to. We want people who will stand up and fight for their principles, and that's important to do so. But ultimately, in a democracy, we have to talk to each other. Used to be rewarded for that. People would say, well, they bipartisanship. Where is that today, in a sense? We'd like to see more of that. Well, if you're going to have bipartisanship, someone's got to compromise in that process. If a democracy is going to work, it must be the case. We do it every day in every aspect of our lives. Why should we expect anything less in the form of government we've embraced, with all of its warts and shortcomings? So I thought I'd just start with that particular notion because it is at the heart of it all, in a sense. That doesn't diminish at all the necessity for fight and push hard for the changes that should have been made decades ago, let alone fighting about over today. And we're going to hear some thoughts on how we can move forward on all of this. But I want to keep in the context of the notion that we need to spend the time talking to each other, where I began the value system of what an institution like this provides. It's a place where people can argue, debate, discuss, and ultimately try to come to some understanding where we can move forward. If we can't move forward, then we sit here and gather year after year and nothing happens, except it gets worse. So I appreciate, again, the values that have been embraced by the university, the state, as well as the wonderful staff here, and Jim and others who put this together. So thank you all very much. Now let me start with a prompt. And Ejim, I'll begin with you on this, and you can both jump in. Carol, you can jump in as well. But the prompt is this. What do you see as the most significant challenges to democracy in the United States? How can we restore the promise of Americans' democracy by building a more inclusive political process?
All right.
Just to start. We're just to start on a simple question here.
Yes. First of all, let me say thank you so much to the university, to the Dodd Center for inviting me, to all the folks, Jim, Kathy, Erica, Jackie, who made my coming possible. And thank you to you, Senator Dodd, for moderating this session. A lifelong public servant. I'm honored to be here with you.
Thank you.
And then, of course, to my sister, goddess, warrior, the most brilliant person I know. I'm fanning out. I mean, I always fan out that we're even friends. Carol Anderson, who I've learned so much from.
Likewise.
So, yes, I'm so honored to be here. And then, like the senator said, just being here over the past day, I've learned so much from the speakers. This is really an incredible institution. I'm kicking myself for not having paid more attention to the center because I came here about 10 years ago. But anyway, okay, so I'll stop there and then get to the question and say, like many of the panelists who've spoken, I've been thinking a lot about democracy and human rights, what we mean. What does it mean to have a system of government that's vested in the power of the people, right? That's of the people, by the people, for the people. I think the question that we don't ask ourselves enough is, who do we mean by the people? Like, who are the people that we're talking about? Does it mean everybody, the people? Does it mean the people who are writing the Constitution and shaping, making our decisions, the people? Who are the people? And when we say something is for the people, who defines what the people's interest is? So one of the former panelists talked about a minority faction, a wealthy minority faction. Sometimes we talk about the majority. But then what about minority groups within the majority? I think that one of the things that we have not wrestled with enough, and this might seem obvious, is that we haven't really talked about our democracy as a human rights project. What do we mean by that? Human rights says that every human being has inherent dignity, right? We are all equal in human rights, in our rights, our inalienable rights that we have simply because we were brought into this world, okay? The UDHR, which I know many of us are familiar with, talks about a democracy or how our governments come from, derive their authority from the will of the people, and that is expressed in universal suffrage, universal and equal suffrage. What does that say? It's universal. It belongs to all people. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights talks about the right to, it goes further, it talks about the right to self-determination, something that I learned from you and others. The US really wrestled, the US government didn't actually want to be in the international documents, this idea of self-determination. And one of our earlier speakers, I think Carrie, can tell us why it would be that the United States would not want the right to self-determination. But I say all that to say that our democracy was not conceived of as a human rights project, and that is the biggest challenge that we have. I'll just say a little bit more on that front. I won't go into this too much because you all know that the framers of the Constitution explicitly left out enslaved Africans who were termed labor, indigenous peoples, and women who weren't even mentioned up until up until the 15th Amendment. Really, was gender talked about, which excluded women. And then we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments that also have been interpreted to exclude people. So we, even with the 15th Amendment, right after, it didn't address, it excluded women, but even after that, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese Americans weren't allowed to vote. They weren't extended the full franchise. And then you had all the Jim Crow laws that continued to deny African Americans and other people of color the franchise. So we have a long history, but it's not just all in the past.
Yes.
Through the sweat, tears, and blood of people in the civil rights movement, we won the Civil Rights Act, we won the Voting Rights Act, and then we keep fighting. So just 2013, our Supreme Court, in their supreme wisdom, decide to make a decision that severely weakens the Voting Rights Act. Okay? And what does that say? Just simply put, there are a few provisions, but one, it says that states that had a long history of discriminating against groups based on race, that had to pre-clear changes to their voting laws, no longer had to do that because our Supreme Court Chief Justice decided that enough progress had been made.
Bless his heart.
Bless his with no proof, with no proof of progress.
Dreadful decision.
Proof of the opposite, actually.
And within days of that decision, already Texas, Alabama.
2 hours.
2 hours. Okay, see, already said they were going to institute restrictive voting rights laws. Okay, and since then we have at least 7 states that were previously required to pre-clear that have already adopted very strict voting rights laws. So our democracy, as Jim said earlier, has always been defined to exclude groups, and to the extent that it's inclusive, it's because of organized struggle and fight, and we have to keep fighting to make sure that everybody is included. So let me see, let me get to my, because you know, I can go off script. I wrote some notes just to make sure that I don't go off script too much. Here's the other thing I just wanted to say before. There's some groups we don't even talk about enough, right? We don't talk about people who've been incarcerated for a felony conviction.
Right.
We take for granted that they should be excluded from suffrage, right? That they shouldn't have the right to vote. And when I tell my students that just up in Canada, you can vote if you're incarcerated, they're surprised because we've normalized that sense of exclusion. We've normalized. So we don't even ask about certain groups. These are challenges, but I think the biggest challenge, and I come back to this, is that we haven't conceived, we don't talk enough of our democracy as a human rights project. And we, in fact, too often pretend that it is inclusive. We don't challenge ourselves enough to be better. And if you
Right.
don't challenge the reality, how are you going to improve it?
Yeah.
So what do I think? Let me jump to the what do I think that we can do? Because I think most of what we've talked about, oh, no, I'm going to say one more thing about the problem. Because what I've talked about in our democracy, and I think too often we focus on the process of democracy, right? But there are two aspects of democracy. There's a process of democracy, and then there's a special outcome. Like, what are we participating in this system for? It's for what it delivers. And if it's not delivering on our basic human rights, people lose faith in the system.
Absolutely.
So if you vote and you cannot take care of your most basic needs, your right to food, your right to water, your right to clean air, your right to health, your right to quality education. I was just talking about how I have to apply in New York City now for my daughter to go to middle school next year, because we have to, even though I have a middle class income, I have to fight to get my daughter into a good public school.
Yeah.
Or else, what are the options? Then you try to scrape out the money for private school, which is a whole nother topic. So, okay. But the point is that if our democracy is not delivering, people lose faith in it. And once they lose faith in it, and if we're not really assessing our democracy on that level, other people would be opportunistic, would be fascists, who we shall not name, can slip in and fill the void. And then they tell you that the reason your democracy is not working
Right.
is because of all these other people. We don't talk about, and this is the other thing I have to say, we don't talk about our unbridled capitalism and how we have really allowed corporate interests and profit to be prioritized over the human rights, over people, over what our needs are. And sadly, a good majority of our politicians are not challenging this enough, right? So whether you're on the right or the left, a lot of our politicians still center corporate profit either because they want to or they have to, because we haven't talked about Citizens United, which I hope someone will ask about. But that means that our democracy is not delivering. And because it's not delivering, people are losing some faith in it.
Yeah.
So I think that what we need to do, I'll say three things and hopefully we can talk more about it. One, you all, the panelists, have just been brilliant. This program here at Connecticut, this close to home,
Yeah.
pre-K, I've always been invited to speak to law schools, and I always tell them that really they should be inviting me to speak to grade schools.
You'll be invited next year. So
Thank you. Because this is where the work, we need to build a human rights culture, because we need to challenge. We need space to create values, shared values that are based on human rights. And it begins, the school is one of the best places to do it. So kudos to you all for this program, this close to home program. We need pre-K human rights education throughout the country. And it sounds pie in the sky sometimes, but you're doing it here. We can do it. We can scale these things.
Yeah.
We need, I think, also more forms of direct democracy. And what do I mean by that? Referenda. That's like, and especially at the local and state level, look at what they were able to do in Florida like 5 years ago, where formerly incarcerated people were able to organize by referendum to regain the right to vote. Now that's been since thwarted by the legislature, who found ways to circumvent the right of the people or the will of the people. But these are examples of being creative. We need to return power to people directly, because our system is broken. It is broken because of all the money that's funded into getting people elected to represent us, so that they're beholden more to the donors that elect them than the people they're supposed to represent. So we need other ways of directly taking power into our hands, There are examples like participatory budgeting that's happening on a small scale in different localities as well. I think that's the second thing that we need to do is just be creative about how we take back power. And I think, I mean, there's so many things, but the third thing I would say is that we also need to start building an human rights infrastructure. That means we need a national human rights institution that's independent, that can hold us accountable to international human rights obligations we've taken on. We're one of the few countries, we're certainly one of the few industrialized countries, if not the only, some of you can tell me if there are others, who don't have this. And Jamil, I'm sure Dakwar, he didn't talk about it, but he can because he's been doing this work on national human rights institutions. I would say also that, I mean, we need our own version of ALEC. That's a whole different story. But I think we also have to look at some redress. We've talked about some of the foundational sins of this country. I don't see that we can truly move forward, especially with some key constituencies. And I'm thinking really of descendants of enslaved Africans in this country. We can't really move forward unless we take seriously the question of reparations. And I feel like for too long, we're just now starting to gain momentum on this question, but for too long, we've sort of pretended that you can build a country on the backs and the sweat, on the exploitation of a whole group. And I'm not forgetting that we took land from, colonized and took land from indigenous peoples of this land. But it's almost as if we think, okay, we're done. We can now move on and everything is okay. Mm-hmm. It's not. And that's why we have this problem of not being able to transfer wealth intergenerationally that Mr. Dunn talked about earlier, because we have not gone back to redress to the extent that we can, because we can't do it completely, some of the sins of the past. And I'll stop there.
Very, very helpful. Thank you.
One of the things that I want us to first understand is that America is an aspirational nation.
Yes. Totally.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. The problem is that when we treat those aspirations as achievements, then we're like, okay, we're done.
Okay, yes.
Ooh, look at us, we have overcome. Look, we took the signs down, look at us. And we're like, no, we get all Amy Winehouse on them. No, no, no. Because it's so important to understand that where we are. I see Officer Dunn in the back. Hello, my brother. Yeah. Because I think about that insurrection. That shocked so many folk that could happen here. Unless you're a historian and you knew about the coup of 1898, where there was a multiracial democracy in Wilmington, North Carolina, and white supremacists attacked that democracy and overthrew that government and installed themselves in power. And the powers that be around them just said, the governor was like, okay, and the president was like, okay. And so when we legitimate the illegitimate, it means we're going to do it again. Mm-hmm. Because there's not accountability. Democracy requires accountability. And also a key element in accountability is that insurrection, that frontal assault on American democracy was about delegitimizing American citizens. So when they say they stole the election in Atlanta, they stole it in Philadelphia, they stole it in Detroit, they stole it in Milwaukee. Notice they didn't say they stole it in Salt Lake City. They stole it in Casper, Wyoming. They stole it in Butte, Montana. Instead, they chose cities that had sizable black populations. And when they went after Maricopa County, it was because you had a large voter turnout of indigenous people and of Latinos. And so what you get is a vision of America, who is an American citizen, that is so narrowed that it destabilizes American democracy. And so part of the work that we have to do, that major groundwork, and this is where the individuals can do this work. It's like when you're sitting around the table with Uncle Jim and he says something crazy, because Uncle Jim will, we all know this. Then you're like, you get all Amy Winehouse on them, right? And then you start throwing facts right at them. These are American citizens who have the right to vote. And so when I think about where we are in terms of the dangers in American society, it is denying the citizenship rights of African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, and the young folk. Because where we're seeing this assault on democracy, this basic right to vote, are on those groups, coming at them hard, hot, and heavy, and making it look legitimate under the big lie of voter fraud. The other piece that is a threat to American democracy is that we have a wide swath of folk who don't believe in facts, who don't believe in evidence, who don't believe that there is actual truth. And so when you come at them with evidence, with fact, with truth, it's like, I don't hear you. I'm not going to hear you. So it's really hard to have a democracy conversation when you realize you're operating under two very different evidence bases, that you don't even have an agreement on facts. So that gets to me the third part. And this is where we're seeing the assault, the full-blown assault on books and on curriculum. Because what is happening in our schools, what is happening in our universities is this assault on knowledge. Because if you can control that knowledge, you can control the fact base. And when you can control that fact base, that means that you can bring fascism in, authoritarianism in, erode, corrode democracy, and make it look like it's supposed to be. This is the way it's supposed to be. The other problem that we have, I know you're like, dang, girl. The other problem that we have is the massive money that is poured in to our election system. Yes. How corrosive that is. I mean, all you have to do is just to look at the way that it has corrupted our judicial system. Y'all know who I'm talking about. Yes. Church say amen. Right? Y'all know who I'm talking about. The way it has corrupted our judicial system. And you think about how we have this notion of America, that American exceptionalism. Justice being blind, holding scales. But when justice is peaking and has had LASIK surgery, the kind of justice that this society, that democracy requires, doesn't happen. This is why you saw that massive protest in 2020 with the killing of George Floyd. It stunned so much of the nation to see how cavalierly a police officer put his knee on the neck of a man who was unarmed and held it there for 9 minutes, knowing that he's being recorded. It spoke to the depth of impunity in that system. It spoke to the depth of inequality that's in that system. We can do better. We must do better. And so a key element in resurrecting, because I'm not saying democracy's dead. We're not there yet. Because one of the things about Americans is that we fight. When it comes to fighting for this nation, when we see it imperiled, we will fight. That is the thing about our history. It tells us we will stand up when we have to stand up. And this is also why they don't want us to know our history. Because it makes it look like this is the way it's going to be. This is inevitable. No, we fight. That's what's inevitable. Mm. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to fight to get rid of the dark money that is in our election system, that's in our political system. We have to fight in order to recognize the humanity, the full humanity of all of our citizens. When I think about the felony disfranchisement law, again, historian, 1867, Congress passes the Reconstruction Act of 1867 that says that basically black men can vote. 1868, Florida passes its permanent felony disfranchisement law, 1 year after the Reconstruction Act. That 1868 law in Florida is what then led to the 2018 Amendment 4 initiative to try to rid that state of permanent felony disfranchisement because of 6.1 million formerly incarcerated folk in the United States who could not vote. 1.7 million of them were in Florida alone. 40% of black men could not vote in Florida in 2018 because of a felony conviction. Over 20% of African Americans could not vote in Florida because of a felony conviction. Now, Florida is able to count their heads for representation in Congress.
Yes.
So it's worse than the 3/5 clause because they're able to count the full body and get the representation for folks who can't vote. And then what makes it so bad, after Amendment 4 passed by over 60%, the legislature went, clutched its heart like it was Fred Sanford, like, Lizbeth, I'm coming, Lizbeth. Woo! Because looking at all of those folks who could now vote was just like, scary, shocking. Mm-hmm. Oh my God, that looks like democracy. We can't have that. So it's like, so let us define what completed sentence looks like. And in that definition, they said that means not only have you served your time and you finish your probation or your parole, then you have to pay all of your fines, fees, and court costs. Mm-hmm. Now, Lord, that smells like a poll tax. Yeah. Because, you don't have to pay your income tax to be able to vote. You don't have to pay your property tax to be able to vote. But now you got to pay fines, fees, and court costs. And so when this thing hits the judiciary, this thing goes up and through the federal courts. The court ruled this is not a poll tax. This is just the completion of their sentence. But it was even worse than that because it was like the worst of the literacy test. Because it said, so the literacy test, when Mississippi's literacy tests were how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Okay, I'm at a major university. You can't answer that? Mr. L., who was part of the village who helped raise me, he grew up in Georgia. His literacy test question was, how high is up? What the courts have ruled on in terms of this poll tax now, of the fines, fees, and court cost, is that Florida doesn't have to tell them how much they owe. So imagine you're trying to pay your fines, fees, and court cost, but nobody will tell you in authority how much you owe. So now you can't vote. So this is just like how high is up? How much do I owe? Because that's the access to the ballot box. That is the access to your citizenship rights. That's where we are in this nation. The willingness to strip folk of their dignity, of their humanity. We have to push back. We have to realize that, as I said, this is an aspirational nation. And yes, the Constitution, bless its heart. When you read through all of the compromises made in that Constitution, a key element in there, though, was the attempt to try to make this nation better. That aspiration is the thing that has made us us. It is the way that women have fought for the right to vote, the way that women are fighting for gender equality and reproductive rights. It is the way that African Americans have fought for their dignity, the way that African Americans have fought for the right to vote and not to be segregated as a badge of servitude. It is the way that indigenous people have fought for their rights. It is the way that immigrants are fighting. It is the way that Latinos are fighting. That aspiration is our hope. That aspiration, and where we know that what we do when Americans are put up against it, we fight. We fight for this nation. We fight for this democracy. So I'll end it there.
Well, someone's going to accuse me of Carol and I knowing each other for many, many years, because I've used that speech about an aspirational people for 35 years, and it's so important. We lose that. We could lose the aspirational quality, and if we do, then we're really in deep trouble.
Yes,
and the reason people are aspirational because they still believe, however marginal it is, that if I work in that system, I can help create change. Yes. And we're
Yes.
discouraging people, I think, on a daily basis from that, watching just the recent events. I should have brought up, by the way, Harry Dunn. Where's Harry? Is Harry still in the back of the room? Well, just, having had my life protected any number of times in that building that I served in, thank you, Harry. And thank you for your fellow officers and the difference they made and the courage you showed on January 6th. A year or so ago, a couple of years ago, we gave the prize, my father's name on it is nice, to the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And what a wonderful day and a half he provided for the students here at UConn, at the law school, as well as the college, and so forth. But he made one point that is so clear. He said, we won the Civil War, but we lost the narrative. And of course, this line, it's a kind of a fun trivia question to ask people. Who won the Civil War? 99% of the people will tell you whether the North won or the Union won. The fact is, the United States won.
Yes.
It was a revolution to overthrow this government. And we've not ever called it that, at least in the normal discourse of history. You talk about the Civil War, who won it. We always refer to the North or the Union and fail to acknowledge what happened. And of course, it was the 1920s that a lot of these statues went up, naming forts and so forth, after Confederate leaders in the country. Not in 1862 or something. You might have said, well, I understand that, but I don't really understand it. But in the 1920s and 30s, this is 70 years after the Civil War, for God's sake. So it's deep ingrained, this difference that we've been raised to believe, regardless of where you live in the country.
Yes.
Even television shows sort of made, there were heroes that were retired or former Confederate officers as they're doing right and justice and so forth. And I don't argue that maybe some of them did the right thing after the Civil War. But nonetheless, to kind of, even our culture was selling this story in a sense. And the Reconstruction, of course, only lasted a few years. And then, of course, with the Jim Crow laws, and we've seen the pains of this. I edited Eleanor Roosevelt when I started these comments earlier. And in so fairness to you, I wanted to just say something, and I'm not suggesting this was a permanent problem. She never mentions the word she. I said he and she, but it was always he. Now that's 1958, and Eleanor Roosevelt was no more articulate an advocate for women's rights. But even beyond, this whole thing in terms of women's rights and so forth, it even carries up until the recent debates and so forth we have, treating women and men totally differently when it comes to fairness and equal justice along the way. Yeah. You brought up a question. I was intrigued. You wrote an article. I think you wrote it. I'm not sure you wrote it, but I don't know if it may have been longer. On last year, August of 2020, the U.S. needs a national plan for racial justice.
Oh, yes.
I was intrigued by it, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have not. Was regrettably, we had an American president a few years ago who withdrew our signature from the International Court of Justice. We had President Bill Clinton on this campus in 1997 to inaugurate the center, a research facility. On that day, the sitting American president at this campus called for and announced his support of being a member of the International Criminal Court. That was the last time anyone of that stature said it, going back almost 30 years ago. But it's a critically important issue, and you've sort of reflected that. Let me play a bit of the devil's advocate with you, in a sense, and I agree with your point. But and I suspect your answer will be, look, we need both. But we need this grassroots involvement. If we just do things at a certain level, and we don't bring people along in the process that understand they've got to be a part of this thing, I worry sometimes that we won't get that kind of that grassroots commitment in a democracy you need, and you leave yourself vulnerable to those who come along promising we'll run the trains on time, we'll keep the streets clean. These are very appealing arguments.
Yes.
Maybe the most popular political leader in Latin America today is the president of El Salvador. His last name is Bukele. Now, he's provided jobs for some people here. Fear is no longer a concern. The gangs are he's locked up 65,000 people without a lawyer, without a judge. Most of them teenage boys on the thing. So it's a safe place to be here. And they've got some work, and the economy's getting a little better. And we're all of a sudden sort of embracing. He's at 90% favorability in the polls in El Salvador. It's a good example to look at here. And so there's less emigration from El Salvador today because people feel safer than were the case. And there's rays of hope on economics, in a sense. But the outrage of incarcerating 65,000 people, literally, and without any due process at all, is an example what's happening around the world in many ways, again, and historically what happened. So tell me whether or not this is do both, because this is sort of a top-down approach you suggested here. And the question is whether or not we'll get the grassroots kind of acceptance of what we need to be doing with what you've suggested. Is that fair?
So, I mean, that's absolutely fair. So here, we spoke, the earlier panel talked a lot about how we need to focus our solutions on the people who are closest to the problem, like are most impacted by problems. So I absolutely believe that we need, actually long term we can't change anything unless we change our culture, and changing our culture is building a grassroots, changing the norms, our understanding of what we should expect from our government from a grassroots level. That's why I love this program, this pre-K program, because it's children, it's really, we're talking at breakfast, we don't have the kinds of spaces that we need anymore to really shape our values and our norms, especially one that centers around human rights. So I absolutely believe that we need to mobilize the grassroots, and we are. There are groups that are doing this incredible work already. On the human rights front, you have, it's small, but it's growing. You have people creating human rights cities around the country, mobilizing. But here's what I'll say also about the National Plan of Action. You also need leadership from the top. And I was impressed years ago by what happened with the death penalty in France, okay? I lived in France, maybe 20 years now, ago. But the French, if one can generalize, the French are arrogant. I think they're better than the Americans in so many ways. But they're very proud of the fact that they have abolished the death penalty. They don't use capital. They just don't use this barbaric practice of endorsing the state killing its own people. Right? But before they passed the law that abolished the death penalty, the majority of French people actually supported it. Why? Because there's certain people who, you have certain consolidated interests, as one of our earlier panelists said, who control the narrative. So sometimes you need a leader to just come in and say, I believe it was Mitterrand, he campaigned on the fact that he would abolish the death penalty because of the guy he slated to be his attorney general. And he followed through on that campaign commitment. Yeah. And now the majority of French people are very proud that they don't use the death penalty. So I think that you need both. You need, because whether we like it or not, there are the people who control the narrative of what we learn, what we hear, are generally have a more vested interest in maintaining wealth and concentrating wealth, or maintaining wealth that's concentrated to a small percentage of the society. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, the answer is obvious, we need both, but I don't want to underplay the importance of having principled leadership.
Absolutely. Good. Carol, do you want to comment on that?
What she said.
Let me just tell you a quick anecdote. This close to home program we're starting here at the university at the center. There's a woman who's been very helpful and supportive financially to give us a chance to demonstrate how this can work.